the Operation Quicklime series of cozy spy novels, and the Old Los Angeles series featuring Maddie Wilcox, a doctor and winemaker in 1870. This series is the one we're going to talk about today. It's set when Los Angeles was no more than a pueblo and not much going on here in the 1870s. There are 3 books, 2 in, 1 coming. I believe the original was
Death of the Zanjero.
Death of the Zanjero, then Death of the City Marshal, and coming up is Death of a Chinaman, correct?
No, Chinese field hands.
Chinese field hand, okay.
Yeah.
Good.
If you know anything about LA history, you know where that's coming from.
Yeah, well, we might hear that. Colleen Fleidner is an award-winning author, journalist, and historian. She's written 3 nonfiction books. She's done radio and TV commercials, screenplays, and hundreds of articles for newspapers, magazines, and online publications. Terribly productive there. She's been a research historian for the Cal State University system. Now, the book she has out now, called In the Shadow of War, Spies, Love, and the Lusitania, is her first novel. But her forthcoming book, Fascinating True Tales from Old California, reflects her love of this deep California history that we're going to enjoy. We have just a handful of those stories, of the many that she's researched. Now, Amanya Wasserman, known on the covers of her book as A.E. Wasserman, is the daughter of a newspaperman who wrote her first novel at 14. She's the author of the 5-book Langford series, full of spies and thieves and murderers. Just think Sherlock Holmes meets Downton Abbey. Her book, 1886, Ties That Bind, finds Lord Langford in San Francisco, where he gets caught in a web of politics and corruption and greed with a pistol-packing beauty, Sally Baxter, so it gets very interesting. She also wrote The Notorious Black Bart, 1883, as what's called a dime novel, which is the cheap novel that Lord Langford actually reads while he's on the train in this book. So it's quite an interesting layering. For myself, I'm a book publishing consultant and developmental editor. I've got 20 years in traditional publishing with companies like Simon & Schuster and Random House. I overlapped the 9 years I spent with 40 publishers with all my editing. So I've been editing for quite a long time. And I help writers develop their work, and I also help independent publishers refine their marketing. Okay, let's start. Let's start with Colleen. You have a bottomless pool of wonderful stories. And I understand that there's a few people that we might recognize, like the story of the Downeys and maybe James Lick. Are these details that shout out to be made into a story?
Oh yeah, oh yeah. I mean, I don't know, but if you want to put it in novel form, I put it in nonfiction form. They're very convoluted, very fascinating stories, and they will really grab you. James Lick, we actually have the astronomer, one of the astronomers here from Lick Observatory in San Jose. And thank you for coming, and thank you for your help. And so I was researching James Lick, and he started out as a piano maker on the East Coast, fell in love. It was kind of a tragic love story because he wasn't allowed to marry the woman that he loved, got her pregnant, but father still wouldn't allow the marriage. So he was determined to make a fortune. And that he did, first by making pianos and then by going to San Francisco. And he was so bright and so ambitious. He bought up, I swear he bought up half the state. And at one point he was the richest man in the state of California. But he died alone, and the woman that he loved married someone else, eventually died. And he had this huge mansion and never furnished it. It's all very quirky, but he did leave a huge legacy so that they could build the observatory. But the thing that he wanted was to be buried under this massive telescope when it was finished, and that flowers be put on his grave every day. And they're still honoring that. So that was, I think he died, well, he died before that, but because the telescope wasn't finished, they buried him under there 10 years later in 1887. So that's quite a story.
Yeah, Yeah, he made a lot of money in land, didn't he?
Yes, and he even owned Santa Catalina Island and
Oh my
wanted to
goodness.
develop it, but it was a little too soon, I think.
Yeah. Yeah.
And part of Griffith Park and, half of California, I think he owned at one point or other. Very interesting story, though.
What's interesting to me about writing about history and writing about the past is that Anne especially finds a way to get the dialogue just right. Can you talk about that a little bit?
You compliment me. I know there's an anachronism or 5 or 10 in there
That's
somewhere.
Okay. Most of it's good.
Well, I'm glad. I have like 5 different Victorian language links on my bookmarked in my browser at all times. I spend a lot of time reading newspapers from the era, but more importantly, Maddie's voice is definitely I owe totally to Louisa May Alcott and Little Women. I just that style. Another one of my favorite childhood books was The Five Little Peppers and How They Grew, and that same sense of storytelling was what I knew would be the right one. And yeah, I really watch out for those. I'm terrified somebody's going to point out, but that's modern. And I know somebody's going to at some point, but I do my best in the meantime.
It's
and
always
thank
hard.
you for the compliment, by the way.
Yeah. It's hard to get the research right. And people who read historical fiction are very demanding that every detail be perfect.
Yeah.
Honey, you've come across that, and your book has an Englishman coming to San Francisco. You have 2 cultures to cross.
Right.
Your language. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, yeah, it really wasn't too difficult because I'd already established Langsford in London in the earlier books. So when he came over to San Francisco, that was just sort of, we transported him across. He was really involved with the very wealthy because he was extremely, wealthy, filthy wealthy, if you want to say that. And he, I don't know why that's doing that. And my computer's beeping, sorry. But he blended right in as far as the rich and the elite. And it wasn't until he accidentally ran into this ranch girl with a pistol in her purse because she was, out for to find out who had murdered her brother, that he got sucked into all of that. So we do have the educated people in America, we have the Englishmen, and then we have the dialect of all the people who were settlers, ranchers, and including some Native Americans in that. So that was sort of a challenge, but it was fun. And I fortunately have a great editor who, he catches me on some of the stuff like, oh no, I'm so embarrassed when he does. But I think I've got a little voice in the back of my head now that says, wait a minute, did they really say that? And then I go back and, catch myself and do some more research. But we try our best. It's hard because if we do everything exactly as it was then, it wouldn't be that readable or understandable. So that's one of the things we have to.
Well, it makes me think of Colleen, who uses newspaper language, and her research is based in those documents at the time. Is that correct? Are those things you find?
Oh yeah, I think we all do that. We all go back to their primary sources to do our research. Yeah, and it does help. It does help. Or reading diaries, but like Amanya was saying, if we wrote the way they actually spoke, it would be more difficult to understand what we're trying to say. So you have to, you do your best. You do your best.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you know what? One of the things that, as I was looking over the 3 of you and the books that you've worked on, there are social issues that come up that were existing then, especially Anne. You've first of all, you're in LA when it was just a dusty town.
Right. 5,000 people approximately. Within 10 years, that would have doubled. So it was growing phenomenally. And between 1880 to 1890, I think it grew 10 times. And it's kind of a fun thing about the period is LA is on the cusp of exploding now, and it was just as culturally diverse then as it is now. And a lot of the same issues may be multiplied because, unfortunately, and I note this in Death of the Chinese Field Hands, because it is a deep problem in that racism was embedded so deeply into the cultural thought process, even among some of the people who were downtrodden as a result of this. And so if you're, it's like I said in my author's note, if you're going to write with any authenticity at all about the 19th century, you have to be aware that people talked in very bigoted ways and very inappropriate ways. And so it's a real tough thing because a lot of that's changed, but some of it hasn't. The difficulties and the problems of racism, I mean, Death of the Chinese Field Hands encompasses a riot that took place on October 21st in 1871 here, in which 18 Chinese men were lynched simply because they were Chinese. And
well, and you have a character in Maddie who is an educated woman from the East Coast, and she brings with her a level of tolerance that creates a really good veneer of conflict on the whole town.
Oh, it does. And you got to keep in mind, LA at the time was also a hotbed of Confederate sympathizers. One of the reasons I wanted to avoid the Civil War when I set this up. And so, I mean, in October 1870, right, when Death of the, or actually most of it takes place in November, but Death of the City Marshal takes place, I'm reading in the newspapers that Robert E. Lee has died and the women of the town are setting up a memorial to him. And I'm thinking, oh yeah, that would go over real big today. Not.
So, Anne, I have a question. Do you find that you have to pull your punches sometimes when you're writing about the racism and sort of cringing and wondering if that's going to work, or do you just go all out?
I have an advantage, and Maddie puts this in the third book too, is that Maddie is more open and tolerant than the vast majority of even people from her own culture on the East Coast. And I suspect some of that, so I kind of put it in there that her mom was probably a Quaker, even though the family's Congregationalist.
That works.
So, yeah, that works. And so she is more tolerant. And one of the characters, Regina Medina, is also very, very tolerant and not very tolerant of the hypocrisy of the era, as we will eventually find. I don't know if we'll eventually find out or how we'll eventually find out, but Regina is a character who is also rejected by the greater population. And that's one of the reasons why she's a madam.
And it's Colleen has found so many characters who faced exactly that. Some of the women characters that you researched, you have a couple of them you can talk about, don't you?
Well, yeah, so far. I am hitting it head on with a section, a long chapter about California and the Civil War. One of the things you were wondering about, some of the shocking things I found out, and I read that when Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, there were celebrations in the streets of Los Angeles with fireworks and parades and flags, and they were really delighted that he was dead. So it was a big struggle, and as Anne said, there were so many former Southerners living here at the time. And one of the reasons that they came was because of especially after the Civil War, there was a huge migration of Southern plantation people and people out of work to reestablish themselves here, because there was land available here and it wasn't as devastated as the South. And then in the North, I'm doing a chapter. I read some of the diaries of people of color, some of the Mexican people, some of the former slaves and so forth that were brought into the gold fields the black slaves were brought into the gold fields by their masters to pan for gold for them or search for gold, and then they would sort of sit on their tushes while their slaves did the gold thing and worked themselves to death, and then they would neatly take the nuggets and the dust and take it in and cash it in. And in one of those stories written by one of the former slaves, he talks about he was fairly young when he came in, and he would find the gold for his master and hand it over to him. And then at night, when his master was asleep, he would go into town and do anything he could, wash things, clean things to earn more money, and he was paid in gold dust. So he had his little bag of gold dust for when they were going to go back to Missouri. And before he could do that, his master took the gold, mixed it in with his own, and claimed it, and so the poor guy got nothing out of it. But eventually, the good news is he got out of there and escaped and came back to California. So that's a good story. There's just so many. And Biddy Mason.
Biddy Mason. Oh, she's big.
Oh, yeah.
She's actually in Death of the City Marshal, because I had a scene.
Good.
Yeah, I have a scene where, Maddie's house is burnt down and everybody's bringing stuff in. And it's the people who have the least. The point of the scene is the people who have the least are giving the most. But when I had the nice African-American lady come in, it came off really bad. And so, Tam, you're talking about pulling the punches. That's one where I really did. I had Biddy come in and saying, hey, thank you. This is a woman of substance. She's one of the richest people in LA at the time. And I'm a woman of substance. You've been kind to my people. We are showing our gratitude by helping you. And, so it really came off a lot better, I hope.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. There's so many of those great stories to weave in your books. Yeah. So many.
One of the great binders of your stories is that California was the economic boom. There were the railroads, there was the gold, there was the land, there was, and each one of you has a pool of information that your story sits on of that economic boom. How about, yours is with the train, Amanya?
Right. Well, the railroads actually were the internet, the equivalent of the internet of that century, because they connected everything like had never been connected before. And, here's a little fun fact is that, and I never thought about it because until the railroads, people would just, walk or go by wagon or stagecoach. And so they didn't travel very far every day. But once you got on a train, you could cover a lot of miles. And they didn't know what time it was when they got to where they were going. At that point in 1883, time zones were invented. And that's the first time we ever needed to have them. And it's like, I never thought about that before. So you get all that great information. But one of the things that, and this sort of ties everything together, and ties the bind. In the Transcontinental Railroad was built by the Union Pacific coming from the east, and the Central Pacific, which later, without getting into all of the corporate stuff, later became the Southern Pacific Railroad. And they met, in Utah, and we all know that story about the Golden Spike. But in order to get there, you see, the railroads were paid $1,600 a mile to build track. And that was a lot of money in those days. Mm-hmm. So what did they want to do? They wanted to keep building. Well, they got the Transcontinental built. Oh, and by the way, here's an aside about the Chinese laborers that they brought over. Charles Crocker, one of the owners of the Southern Pacific Railroad, imported, if you will, over 200,000 Chinese workers for the Transcontinental Railroad. Well, when that was done, he didn't need all of them, and so they just were let go. Were they sent back? No, they were not given fare to go back to China. They were just set loose to become whatever they could become. They became cooks, they became laundry people. They also became, and we don't always know this, sheep herders. So that was an aside. But our railroads then, Southern Pacific Railroad actually built California because they wanted to continue to lay track. And what better? It's a very long state all the way down to LA. And now I'm going to get into your area a little bit. And in that when they got there, this was later than where you're writing, a couple decades later, they wanted to be able to build from LA, Los Oliveras Street on over to the coast. That's more money. And well, how do you get people to want to take the train there? Well, you promote development. So they worked with developers to build more houses. And they actually started Sunset Magazine. because if they put that out there and sent Sunset Magazine everywhere, people would buy it. They'd see, oh, I want to go live there. I want to take the train. And, so that got more people out there, and then they could build more track. So they really, really built California because they made it accessible for so many people.
Well,
Yeah, no, that's really true. Although LA did have a rail lane going from downtown LA to what is now Wilmington and San Pedro as early as the 1860 something or other. I forget the exact date, but it was before my story, about a couple of years.
Right, right. Well, what they did is they also bought out existing tracks or competed with them until they went broke. There's so much graft and greed because, they got everything through Congress, and it was just amazing. And Colleen, I don't know if you find this when you go into your research. I was mind boggled. I came up across, I went down, as Anne calls it, the rabbit hole into research, came up, a few hours later, or days, I forget. And I found these published letters. They were published anonymously. They were handwritten, and they were dated, all about bribery for congressmen and getting the approval for the different railroads. It turned my story of the 1886 Ties that Bind right on its ear. And it was perfect because I really needed that extra, bad guy stuff. But what was scary is that it really happened. It really happened.
Yes.
It's like, wow.
Colleen has a story about that, don't you? The swindler.
Well, which one? Well, there's Downey, who was involved with getting the railroad to come through from San Francisco to Southern California, where he owned a lot of land. And he wanted to develop, he was also one of these guys that came in and bought up land. And he bought up the area that's now Downey, named after him. And it was one of the very first subdivisions in California, in Southern California. Mm-hmm. So what did he want? He wanted that railroad to come by where the property was that he owned. And there's all of the money that they get in the, from a railroad to go through. They get a monthly stipend for every mile or something like that. Right. So he got even richer off of that. Do you know the story about he and his wife and the railroad disaster?
Yes, I do, as a matter of fact.
Yeah. I wrote about that. They could not find his wife's body, the governor's wife's body, in the wreckage, they said. And I've been trying to track it down. I need to get together with your husband for the Calvary. Is it Calvary? The first Catholic cemetery in Los Angeles that now is in the area where the Catholic high school is. And he's still there under the high school.
See, the research is still being uncovered. We're still digging for the research and finding all this wonderful stuff.
It's like an archaeological dig when you start doing that. You go into those newspapers like Colleen was talking about. You read those headlines, and thank goodness for everything that has been scanned, because we have access for that. And 10, 20 years ago, we would be toast. We wouldn't be able to do
I did most of Fascinating Rhythm the old-fashioned way.
Right. Well,
my research on that. But I just recently discovered a whole bunch of online medical journals.
Yeah, those
that turned everything I had written in my first two books on its ear, and that was oh my God, those are so much fun.
But the interesting thing is how you take this research and turn it into a really good story. I mean, you have to create characters, you have to create a story. You have to weave it in without overwhelming your story. And I think that's what's interesting to readers. How did you do that?
Oh, no, I have no idea.
Well, of course you do.
Well, I mean, I do. A lot of it, I think, is because research is an ongoing thing. I think, Amanda, you said something along with at some point we were talking about it, or Colleen did, is that, you start your research, you get a certain base done, then you start your story, and then all of a sudden you realize, oh, wait, were they using fountain pens in the 1920s, And you realize, oh, wait, was there sterile surgery in California and all that other stuff? And you realize, oh, wait, there's more to learn. And then sometimes as you're going along looking this stuff up, you realize, oh, my God, there's more of a story there. When I was reading the newspapers for Death of the City Marshal, again, that's based on a real live event. Now, yes, I massaged this one, okay? Marshal Warren probably did die of the wounds he received in the gunfight, but I kind of cheated, and he doesn't die of the wounds because, well, you can't have a whodunit if you know who done it. So I found a way to posit that, you know, maybe he didn't die of those wounds. And I think the other thing I did with it was kind of fun was give reason why that official version stood. But the thing I discovered as I'm reading the newspaper, there's this little ad in the bottom of the one in the corner saying, Robert Gaines will no longer pay the debts of his daughter Lavina Gaines. I said, what? 16-year-old kid. Merchants are on notice. I'm not paying any more of her debts. Well, that's interesting. So next thing I know, I've got a secondary character who unfortunately will be the heiress and death of an heiress. So I'm not looking forward to bumping her off.
It's hard to stop. It's hard to stop when you have such history that is so interesting that it just shouts out at you to make a story around it.
I think for what I do, I'm sorry to interrupt, but you know, I start with, you know, a general curve of a plot, a very general. I don't plot things out. But as I go along and I do research, you know, like, you know, Anne and Colleen were talking about, you go in there like, oh yeah, what is this? What is you find? And then you find a headline from that date, and you go, wow, and you find a way to incorporate that. What it is, for me, the research, the historical aspect is the setting for the story. And you know, and the people are just historical characters with the same, you know, virtues and flaws and struggles and everything that we do have. Exactly. And so when we're in that time period, you know, I have freed slaves in San Francisco who had been brought from the South and retrained so that they could be workers in the beautiful Palace Hotel in San Francisco. So we have those. We have the Chinese people, but you know, all of those are part of the story. When you're telling the story about a railroad, those just are. So it wasn't that I found the research and then wanted to tell a story about it. It was sort of the other way around. That said, the stories morph, they evolve, they go places you had no idea where they were going to go, right? Yeah, like, oh wow, I guess
been there, done that.
Out. Yeah. Colleen, do you find that? Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. And you know, the other thing I've been finding is that, well, like I was saying, you have Crocker, and then of course Downey's part of that, and all of the people. There's so much cross-pollination in the stories. You know, I'm writing a story about James Lick, and he's a friend of Girardelli, and they meet in South America, and he talks Girardelli into coming to California. And Girardelli becomes a millionaire up there and starts his chocolate company up there. You know, and
like who knew?
I guess there wasn't enough population that, and if you're going to be rich, everybody around you is.
Well, and you know, you have all these cross-pollinated stories, and they all sit on a wonderful sense of place that you can develop of California in the 1860s. I know in Anne's book, your settings just make you stop and say, hey, wait a minute, he's in the tar business? I guess that turns into the tar pits that I know.
Well, probably not.
The settings that you create and the sense of place that you create can be already familiar to us.
Well, in the case of most of the streets, should be already familiar to us. Now, she's talking about Calle Primavera. She's talking about Calle Principal, Alameda Street, but we know where Alameda Street is. These streets still exist. And Calle Primavera we know as Spring Street. Main Street for Calle Principal, there's Colegio, which is College Avenue if it's downtown, if you ever go down to there. And it's kind of fun because, you know, every time I go down there, and I do fairly often, you get the feeling that, yeah, I've been down here. I know where these places are. I mentioned the Pico House, which had just been opened. when Death of the Zonjero starts. And
Yeah,
these
it's
places
like
are
you're
still there.
walking, history's beneath your feet wherever you are, really, and because we're in
Yeah.
California, it's here. So yeah, I do the same thing in San Francisco. I lived there, I worked there, I was married in San Francisco. So when I'm writing about San Francisco, it's just, easy. You get the sense of the place, the feel of the place, even though it's a different century. You can still, kind of embrace that. I don't know really how to explain that more,
Well,
emphatically than that, but
they're ghosts. I mean, Colleen has so many ghosts that come out of her research that I
Yeah.
can just see the characters taking
Yeah,
shape.
exactly.
There's a couple more. I mean, the details that Colleen has collected in her research is, fun and fascinating. There's research about ladybugs. Tell us about that one.
Oh gosh, I have some of those did you know kind of moments when I do my research. Well, the ladybugs came, the cotton plague or something like that came in just as the big orange groves were taking off in the 1880s. And they came in with plants from Australia, this scourge. And they weren't aphids, it was something else. And basically it was a minute lice kind of thing that ate the leaves and so forth. So somebody had the brilliant idea. They tried all kinds of ways to save the orange crops, which by then they were called the the fruit golden nuggets or something like that.
Yeah.
So it really made a big difference in the economy. And they sent off to Australia. They figured, well, they have the ladybugs down there. Let's bring a load up here and see what happens, because they eat that cotton scourge down there, and that's what saved the orange trees. So that was the origin of the ladybugs here and why they're called lucky ladybugs. So all these little fun stories, try to throw them in.
The stories are there to enrich your novel, and you must have a dozen novels, Colleen.
No time to write them all, huh?
Well, yes.
So many stories aren't there in this area, and it's California. My gosh, it would take 2 lifetimes to write all the novels about the things that
I think that's one of the things, to build on that, Colleen, because you're absolutely right. It's one of the things that kind of drives me nuts sometimes, is that people don't realize just how much history there is here, especially in Los Angeles. We were still fighting the Revolutionary War when Los Angeles was founded, 1781. There is a lot, and if you really want to go back into the Native American days and the prehistory, like in the tar pits and everything, there's stuff in there that's just fascinating. This is actually a very culturally rich area. And, if we start, if we think his history as being beyond the what's obvious. I mean, a lot of people, when they think of LA history, they think of the 20s, they think of the 40s when the big bands and all that other stuff. And yeah, that was all here, but that didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened because there was this pueblo that somehow ended up, even though it wasn't on the main source of the water, still ended up being the primary source of water for the county. And then when we stole some more in 1913 with the rape of the Owens Valley in Mulholland, and then, it just, right after that, you've got city after city after city in the area. Many of the neighborhoods in LA, Eagle Rock, Highland Park, Sawtell, these were all individual cities until the early 20th century, when all of a sudden there's water here and everybody wants water. So we're going to hitch our wagon to the city of LA. Next thing you know, you've got this big sprawl. And that's literally how the city grew.
You know what? We don't get that information best from the history books. We get it from the historical fiction.
Right.
Yeah.
And you are the ones who bring us the history that makes sense to us, that we can really engage with. So,
well, it's very sweet of you, Paul.
No, but the history books, we read them in grammar school and we just walk away. But the historical fiction is what brings it all to us.
Right. I have to tell you that the last time I took history was, world history in the 10th grade with Mr. White. And the only reason I got A's is because, I managed to, squeak with a B on the test. But at the exam, he would raise our grade a letter if we read a classic and read a report on it. So like, okay, that's right up my bailiwick. So I was able to do that. And then I think the only thing I learned from that class was, the Battle of Hastings, 1066. That sort of stuck with me. So when I landed, I was telling the story in my first book. It was based on a true story. It landed me in historical fiction, and I'm going like, how on earth did I land in this genre? But yeah, and I landed in it, and I love it, and and all of a sudden, history starts being important and wonderful and delicious, and you just get hooked on it at that point, because it's just there's so many stories, Colleen, right?
Right, yeah. My mother used to say that she read Michener. That was some of the first historical fiction I read for her books. That's how she learned history. And I said, you better make sure it's all correct. But he did a pretty good job of it, except one or two. But yeah, I mean, I've had a lot of people say they hated history in high school or college, and then they started reading historical novels. And
That's right.
voila.
That's exactly what we're saying.
Well, I think we forget that history is story. I couldn't tell you this date or that. I'm terrible at dates. And I'm not interested in dates. And there are a few that stick with me, but I'm not interested in that. I want to know how people lived, how they dealt with things.
Who the people were.
Yeah. And, it's kind of funny because I've been getting this a lot. And Pamela, we're going to we're going sideways here. Just warning you. But the idea that we're living in historical times now.
Yeah.
We forget that. I remember in high school when I was 15 years old, we were doing American history. I liked history. It was okay. I wasn't a bad student, but I wasn't like the first thing I'd ever want to read, And Spiro Agnew resigned. And they made the announcement over the loudspeaker in the history class, and Gary Cardinelli, God bless him, got up and yelled, "That's history! That's what this is about. You are witnessing history." And I went, "What?" Oh my God.
It'd be nice to go forward 100 years and look back at now to see, how the history is playing out. Because I feel like sometimes we're in a sci-fi movie and we just don't know how it ends. But
well,
yeah.
Welcome to reality. We are. And I don't care what end of the political spectrum you're on. It's just that's reality, period.
What I like about it is when I do research and I'm doing something and find out something that's going to be beneficial for the story, I often go like, aha, oh, that's why that is the way that is. Oh, that's how that happened.
Yes.
It's because otherwise you don't know, right, Pam?
Well, the events don't happen in a vacuum. They happen in a whole culture of forces that are pushing things forward. And to understand the story, you have to build the setting, you have to build the sense of place, you have to build the people who are in it and why they're there. And
it's just not linear either, and just not one or two people. It gets very entangled, as Colleen pointed out.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Yes.
I mean, I have Downeys in one of my books.
Well, we're getting close to the time when we can open it up for some questions. And it's wonderful to talk to you about this, because this is where we learn history in fiction, but it's not really fiction. It's very historically based. And, I'd love to hear from some of our participants to see if you have any questions. How are we doing? You can unmute.
Unmute?
Yeah.
All right.
I see some new faces too.
Oh yeah.
So how do we ask? Just
Go right ahead.
Go ask.
Okay, just who was mentioning when the Chinese were let go after the
That was Amanya.
Yeah, but wasn't there a whole massacre going on then too? If I remember, I know not the one you're talking about, Anne, the hanging, but I surely thought that they were actually sometimes buried.
Yes,
Yeah.
there were some. It wasn't something that I incorporated in my book, but many of them, like I said, they became sheep herders. They were doing whatever they could do, and they were safer if they were away from the urban areas. So actually, here's another little ditty. In the Central Valley, which most people in California really don't pay a whole lot of attention, it's that long, boring stretch of land that you go through on I-5 when you're going north. The little town of Hanford was a Chinese sheep camp. And the Southern Pacific Railroad was busy building and using, the Chinese as well for the labor, building track out there. Well, it was one of the, what was his name? It was James Hanford, who worked for the Southern Pacific Railroad, who came out and saw the sheep camp and thought, oh, this is a great place to build a town and have a depot. And so it was declared. And to accommodate the Chinese, they had Chinatown right there in Hanford, and kept them very, very closely, controlled. But I think they lost their sheep too. I'm not quite sure what happened, but yeah, they were just discriminated against left and right. And I could have followed that thread a little further with my research, but I didn't. My story ended up going in a different place. But that's one of those things that, yes, very easily when you find out more about those horrific things, you definitely, could incorporate in that history. That is a story that should be told. Definitely.
Yes. How about
Thank
another
you.
question? Do we have anyone else?
I have one for Anne.
Sure.
And this is kind of weird because you said that Gary Cardinale said that's history. Was he your teacher?
Yes, he was the teacher. I'm sorry. Was that clear?
I think I went to school with him.
Holy crud! Holy crud! Tall
Maybe
redheaded guy, glasses.
Yeah, kind of got the name that rang a bell with me. And I think we were at Laverne together or something. Maybe.
You may have been. That may have been him. I think he was at Laverne. I was at El Dorado High School in Placentia in Orange County.
Uh-huh.
Yes, from Colleen's part of the world.
Talk about coincidence.
I would love to at some point let him know that I remember that experience, because it really was a bellwether for me. It just, I mean,
Yeah.
I just got more and more interested in history the more I learned. And again, it's about the details. It's the it's the people. It's the story. And one of the things I got interested in women's history specifically was because that was so not taught. There's people like, well, you don't hear about people like Biddy Mason in school, and yet this woman was amazing. I mean, she really built wealth the good old-fashioned way. Pulled herself. She was a former slave, sued because her masters had brought her to California. California was a free state. Sued her masters, and she couldn't even testify in court. She had to get someone else to testify for her.
Wow.
Sued her masters, won her freedom for herself and several other people, and then went on to work with this one guy who was, I believe, a land developer, and earned a fair amount of the money herself. And like I said, by 1870, she was one of the richest people in LA. She founded the first AME church in LA, one of the founding members there. Just quite a woman. We don't.
You got it. You have to. I just want to say something on that end, and because I was researching it for a while, and I get so mad when I start researching for people of color, because that the history is squashed.
Yeah.
Nobody wanted to let know that there was a Black woman that was rich. Let me just tell you.
It's there, and Colleen has found so many of those stories.
How about Mary Ellen Pleasant? Have you researched her up in San Francisco?
Mary Ellen Pleasant is very familiar.
Yeah. She sued the cable car company up in San Francisco because they wouldn't allow African Americans at all on the cable cars. So she sued and won, but she went through hell, and she became extremely rich too, but she was taken advantage of over and over and died without anything. Very sad ending, but she was an amazing woman.
Yeah.
Well, wonderful. Thank you all. This is great. Do you have any more to say about your books? Amani, you have 1886, The Ties That Bind. And you have 3 books to talk about. Colleen's books are going to be coming.
Okay.
I know that I can see all those stories in just, not just one book, but I can see them in several small books too.
Well, I had planned to have the whole thing ready and done by now, but with the plague that's going on right now, societies, university libraries are closed. So I've had a dickens of a time trying to find research, to really, go down the rabbit hole and find Mrs. Downey's body and things like that.
That would be interesting.
Oh, and I was going to say too, the high school, they know about the bodies that were still left in the ground, and they call their sports teams are called the Phantoms.
Yeah.
Honor. I think that was really something.
Okay. I just put my link to my fiction page in the chat, so you guys can click and go right there if you want to find out more about my books and my other stories.
Yes, and we have put the link to the historical speakers site, where all of our speakers are listed, and you can find their books. There's so much more to talk about.
And Death of the Chinese Field Hands, if you go to like Vromans.com or to bookshop.org and look me up, it's available for pre-order.
Oh,
and if you are kind enough to sign up for my newsletter, which you can do on my website, from anywhere on my website, and please do, you'll find out when the ebook is going to be available for pre-sale, as in you can read it early. So
Very good, very good. Thank you, and thank you, Santa Clarita Library, for giving us an opportunity
Thank
to
you,
come and talk
Morgan.
with you about the things we love the most.
yeah, I mean, we could talk forever.
Yes, we could. As they say in the South, we could talk a week.
Well, thank you so much. We're so pleased to have you again. And I put the link to the library in the chat box as well. A good place to find info on upcoming history talks after we put them on the calendar. So look out for that coming in the fall. We're working on it. And thank you again to everybody. It's just, as always, a huge pleasure. Thank you so much.
Well, Morgan, thank you so much for having us. It's
Thank you, Morgan. This has been a great series.